Welcome to the Narrator Roundtable. I'm André Santana. Joining me today, we have Kirt.
Hi, André. How's it going?
Hello. I'm doing good, thank you. And I love it. We're going to have an intimate little episode today.
We're holding down the fort, you and I.
We are. Yes. Get rest, y'all. Get rest. So, the thing I'm curious about today is, why do we narrate? Is it because we love storytelling? Is it because we're looking for books that make us fall in love with reading again? And if that's the case, why do so many of us take on projects we're not passionate about for the money? Are we really just here to pay the rent? Why does it feel like we're always waiting for that big book, that big award, that big break? So, is it notoriety? Is it fan appeal? We've had conversations about negotiating. We've had conversations about resources for staying focused and about so many things to help us get through the career. But today, I just kind of want to talk about, why do we want to get through the career? And so for this conversation, I'm really excited to have on Alex Knox. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much for having me, and hello.
Our pleasure. He has a decade of stage and on-camera work under his belt, almost 200 titles narrated, and a recent Audie nomination on the checklist. But also, he's just a thoughtful guy, and we're so excited to have him on. So welcome to the Narrator Roundtable.
I am so thrilled to talk to you all. I have listened to every episode, and some of them multiple times. And I'm so interested to talk about this topic today.
It feels like we're going to arrive at complexity, but we don't have to start there. And so my opening question is just where are y'all now? Why do you do this work?
I mean, it's a great question. It's like, when you pose that question, I kind of found myself going do I think about why my first answer was well, because it's my job. And this is this career that I'm lucky to do that I didn't necessarily pursue from the start, but then once it started to happen, I was like, this is amazing. I really became invested and wanted to keep going. But I had to take a minute and go what is it that makes me want to keep doing it? And I mean, I think for me, it's definitely tied to the fact that it is rooted in the things I love about art, about acting, that I get to perform and do these things that were kind of takes advantage of the childlike, the wonderment and the playfulness and the silliness of being a child, that I think kind of is how I fell in love with acting in general. And then it kind of is married with but it's this thing that is in this package that is doable and repeatable, and there's a need for it. So I'm hey, they need me, or they seem to want me, so I want to show up.
Yeah. What about
Yeah,
you, Kirt?
I would say it's a complex answer with a lot of different moving parts. I would say, obviously what motivates me today is a lot different than what motivated me when I was first getting into it. And a lot of it does have to do with the economic side. It is money is a motivator. It's why I take a lot of the gigs that I do. But it's also, this isn't my favorite job I've ever had, but it's definitely top 3. And it's hard to imagine a more fun or fulfilling existence than what this offers to somebody who is my age, where I live, and has my background. It's hard to think of something that could be more fulfilling, even though nowadays, most days, it feels like a job.
Yeah.
It feels like, anytime you take your hobbies or something you love and you turn it into the thing that gets you money, eventually it feels like your job. And I'm at the point where it most days feels like my job. And every once in a while, a really incredible story breaks through, and it makes me reconnect to all of the parts of myself that love storytelling and love becoming another character and love connecting with an audience. But those are more rare than the day-to-day stories that I am telling, because it's my work. It's what I do.
Yeah. It's funny what you're saying about like it becoming the work and shifting with that. Like, I have challenges in this job that I've had since it began that fundamentally transformed the deeper I went into full time. And specifically, like, with time management, with like navigating my ADHD and like working alone and recording home and all those different things. But like, I do still feel like I love the titles that I do. I feel fortunate in that context. Um, but I am also now in a place where, because I don't have like a second supplemental income, it is really important to like go and reach out and track down the work and do all this sourcing that doesn't necessarily feel like the spirit of the art and the play, like you were talking about, Alex, which I love and is a huge part of it for me. Um, but having that component and having to navigate all those different things and having to like structurally explore challenges I have in my life anyways in order to be my best self at this work has made it really real for me. And I feel like I say all the time that like I grew up in audiobooks, or like audiobooks raised me. And I feel like that constantly becomes like a real actual practical thing I can point to in terms of the experiences that I've had so far. Um, but I do feel like the reason that I don't leave or try something else or go back to doing something with a more consistent paycheck is because Kirt, you said top 3 jobs. This is leaps and bounds by far my most favorite job I've ever had.
Hmm.
And I think even in my hardest moments, it has continued to be that for me. Um, and I also feel like we all arrive at this work in like such different places. I know so many narrators, we've had narrators on who are parents who like come out of 20 years of corporate work or radio work or whatever into this job. Um, and it's the same context as like someone loving the college they went to. Like everybody arrives in a different place, and so the story changes. And in that regard, like Kirt, you mentioned this changing over time for you. Like, how has that transformed?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is just the excitement of something new. And maybe not everybody feels that way, but my brain certainly likes to seek out new creative endeavors. Um, I have said before, I think even on this podcast, that like what I love to do is to make things. I love to make content. I love to make items. I like learning new processes, new softwares, new gadgets, like anything that engages that creative side of me. I really love. But once I have, let's not say mastered, but once I am adequate at the thing, once I can do it without too much engagement, my little brain starts to seek out the next thing I can learn about. And so what has happened with this job is that for the first 3-4 years, there was just so much to learn and internalize and fix and make better and learn about the technology, the gear, the software, navigating the people, the networks, the whole scene, finding friendships, like all of that was new and exciting. And there's always something to grasp onto and engage my brain. And after like year 4, year 5, year 6, it started to feel like, all right, I got this. Like, this is something I can do fairly well without a great deal of effort. And once that started to happen, it was like, okay, now my brain's looking for like, what's next? What's on the horizon? And yet, I will say, like, the caveat of like, this is definitely in my top 3 jobs. I love it. It pays much better than the other 2 jobs, which I loved, which were like for a nonprofit and a community theater. So like I love jobs where they want to pay me nothing. So this is fantastic that I finally found something I enjoy doing and has held my attention for this many years, where they actually want to pay me money to do this work. So I mean, I sort of said that like it was a negative thing at the beginning, like it's for the money, it's work. But like honestly, like it's fantastic that this work does pay a living wage. If you're doing it full time and you're getting pretty consistent work, like this is a great gig, and it pays much better than, the community theater down the street, which I love.
Yeah.
Love to do it. If I was independently wealthy, I'd probably be doing more stuff like that. But this is the way my creativity can still be exercised. And now my hobbies have just had to become other things that take my attention away. But in positive ways, because I have to split my creative energy. Otherwise, if I'm giving it all to one thing, I'll start to hate it.
I totally relate to that. I mean, it's been, for me, the journey has been, there came a point where I started to not have to hustle as much to get these gigs. And then pretty soon I'm like, oh, this is full time, and I'm actually having to, you know, reserve time to not be doing it, which is just unheard of with any other gig. As many of us who, whether you're an actor or not, I mean, it's familiar to be working 5 or 6 different jobs. You're just kind of cobbling things together. And this is like the first time I ever was like, oh, I can kind of like let these other things fall away, which is great. But then, but now I am just doing this one thing. I find that when I'm doing a project that is not as resonant with me, or if I'm just kind of having that feeling you said, Kirt, of like, yeah, I kind of know what I got to do. And that's when I'm like, okay, I have to tap into something else. And as I was thinking about the topic for today, I was like, maybe that's when the purpose comes in. Cause that's when I'm like, well, I really want to see if I can deepen this somehow, or bring some, I love performing live. I love performing with an ensemble. I love performing. Like, one of my favorite jobs I ever had was at a theme park. I was working at Universal Studios, and I was playing like a silent clown type character wearing like a British palace guard uniform. And I would like pretend I was a statue, and then I would like goof around, act like Mr. Bean, or just kind of be this goofy clown that was kind of, that role was like a realization of like my childhood dream to just be silly and make people kind of like come out of their if they're just kind of walking through life not paying attention, you kind of go, hey, I'm being silly over here. Like that was kind of the thing that was felt like, this is what I love, this is my purpose.
Yeah.
So I'll be doing a book that I'm like, yeah, this is maybe not the most exciting, it feels kind of conventional, and I'll think, okay, can I bring that character into this somehow? Can I make this weird somehow? Can I just, what can I do to give this purpose? Because it doesn't feel like it's giving that to me on its own.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I've been working on a project where I have to listen to a lot of different titles right now, and like going through and listening to them. People talk about this when they talk about like casting and like listening to auditions. It's like you can have a list of 100 things, and you're going through and you're hitting play, and you're like, yeah, like that's the work. That's the work. And then there is a type of way some people come at it that just like immediately jumps out at you and feels alive and like pulls your attention in. And it's really interesting for that to just like reach out and grab you. And yeah, I did start this work as a hobby. I'm sure a lot of people like came to it in the same way. And it was just kind of like fun and curious, especially when I got to the part where I could record as a hobby without having to edit. The first time I had to edit, I was like, take my fingers, just take them away from me and don't give them back, please. So thank you for editing this podcast, Kirt. But
see, I love it. I like learning, like learning how to edit a podcast when I first did it. And then again in 2023, when like video was added, I love that. I love learning that stuff.
And now that I know how to do it, I also hate it significantly less. But it really did, I think, like, there was this point that was so short for me with audiobooks. I think it lasted like 2 to 3 titles where it was explicitly only a hobby. And I had no training at that point. There was no kind of like foundation. There was no sense of like this isn't what all my training was for, kind of whatever. Like there wasn't any conflict in that sense.
Can we say you had no formal training?
Okay, I'll take it.
Because I think there's a lot of things in life that train you.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And I'm sure I've said so many things in other episodes that would completely agree with you. Yeah, I had no formal acting training. And I do really feel like there was something really interesting about that tiny little space in that part of my narration history where all of these kinds of questions about how am I going to balance this among the rest of my life? How am I going to like protect my voice? Like how am I going to like connect with the community? I had no concept of there being like a community at that point. And I feel like I regularly come back and try to ask myself like how much of that little spark of this kind of like untethered joy is still present for me in narration. And there are lots of types of joy present for me. Like I said, favorite job, love this work, amazing books, really grateful for them. But it does feel different. It feels contextualized. It feels like the thing that pays my rent. It feels like all these other components. It feels like there are implications to, you know, how authentically I can come to a work when the author like has a dimension of identity that they really want to see honored, or it feels different when you know, the producer implies there's some kind of like significance, gravitas, whatever to the role or whatever it is. There's joy, but I feel like the moments where I get to feel that untethered again are few and far between. I feel like there are often moments where, like, there's been a couple times where the author was dead. It's like 100-year-old book. The author is dead. There's no one to be beholden to. You have like a playground in front of you. But I guess like part of the reason I think about that is because the transformation over time has been like intensive for me. This is my third job in my life. And I always feel like I'm trying to like synthesize this like thing floating inside my body from like over the course of a year into a sentence and never able to. But it does really seem like I want to be able to go as far as I can and still feel like some part of that untethered joy is in me, even when other forms of joy are present. And I feel like all of the kinds of conversations we have about, like, you know, we had a conversation about horror recently and talked about navigating like a really difficult, emotionally weighty scene and like having to walk away for a second. All these kinds of like resources, supports, etc., that make it sustainable feel like they become part of my equation for how I find that untethered joy again. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, as much as any of these conversations make sense to anybody. Because you said it, like you're trying to synthesize a year's worth of feelings and make it coherent in a 60-minute podcast. It's hard to do, which is why we don't do just one of these. We do many of them over the course of a time, and why so few of them come in under 60 minutes.
I'm so sorry.
As you were talking, though, I was wondering if part of it isn't when it became full-time for us, when projects became back to back to back. Is it that we simply lost the time to enjoy and celebrate the last thing we did? Because I remember when I had like 15 titles and people would ask me what my favorite was, and like I was like, oh, it's this book, and I could tell you all about it. And I was like, and I love this character, and this, oh my God, this one scene was so great. And then when I had 100 books, I could still point to like a couple of books that I had done recently that I really enjoyed. And I was like, yeah, this is something I did. And now at 250 plus, somebody asks me what my favorite book is, and I go blank. I'm like, what? Well, I've done a lot. Could I tell you anything about, like, I would need a few minutes to stop and think about and probably go look at my calendar to be like, okay, yes, okay, so 2 weeks ago I was working on this book and it was about this and you know,
Yeah.
but there's just not time to celebrate or enjoy
Yeah.
the books that you, even when you love them, there's not time to like sit in it and be like, oh, I loved that, unless you have a really well-timed vacation.
Yeah. 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 I remember narrating something and I met the author at an event and I was like, it had been like months since I had narrated the title. And I walked up to the author and I was like, oh, by the way, I, it was like a multicast. I got to narrate like this one character's chapters. Like it was such a great time. Thank you. And she was like, oh yeah, like you narrated this character, right? Because I think there were 2 male characters in the book. And I was like, I think so. And it was, I had done like 10 books since then. And it was this kind of, the joy was hovering inside of me. I connected that joy to having narrated that title, but then the details were not like spluttering out. And it felt like a disconnect because you want to, like when you're asked, like, what's your favorite title? You want to communicate that joy.
Well, and I'll just note that, we're talking about narrating as like, this is a job. It's my job. But really, like, every book is a job, right? So it's like between the jobs is the thing that, I mean, like you said, Kirt, they feel like they're almost overlapping where, I mean, I'll be conscious of it when I'll finish a book and then the next day I'll do another book and I'm like, oh, whoa, like switching to a new author or a different genre, sometimes it can feel so jarring. And I've learned to like, okay, the first day on another book, I'm going to only plan to do like maybe one finished hour or something because it's just this whipping from one thing to the other. But yeah, I remember the first few books, the finishing of the first book or 2 was like, I've climbed the mountain and I did this huge, like it's a big deal to narrate an entire book. You're doing I had someone told me it's like doing a one-person Shakespeare play. You are doing the whole thing. It's so heavy with the language. And so
I had a friend text me last night saying they just started reading out loud to their kids and gained a whole new respect for what we do. Because it was their first time having to read out loud.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. You know what it was? Something about how long we get to sit with this work. I feel like it releases a lot of implications. People who've been in the industry for a long time talk about how like 20 years ago they paid significantly more, sometimes twice as much as the average title pays now, but they were also putting out like a 10th, right, of the amount of work. And we had posted on Instagram this, like, what would you change in the industry if there were kind of, like no consequences, like you get to change whatever you want. And something someone said was about the amount of time that we get to sit with a title. That reality is so true because I do wonder how many narrators, if we could make the same income doing half the amount of books, would take the time, prep the title, really like sit with it, maybe mark it up in the same way that you do with an on-stage or on-screen script. How many more, if I wouldn't necessarily want this every time, there are real reasons we don't always communicate with the author, but sometimes like there are authors who are really good to sit with, who are going to give you information, who are going to send you the playlist they made and like the character sheets that they put together when they wrote the book. Like if we were really integrated into the lifespan of a book in a same way, rather than this title's coming out, you're recording it as the first print edition is coming out. Sorry if you catch a typo, it's not going to be fixed in the first print edition. And now you've got a week and a half to turn this around, and we're going to do pickups, and now it's out in the world. And this thing that might be the representation of 7 years of work for an author is the representation of like 2 weeks of touch points for us. And then we have to run into the next one.
Right. Yeah, I just think about, so I use Airtable to organize all of my projects. And I have a specific view that's just for the projects that I am currently working on. So that means they're anywhere in the process between prep and released.
Hmm.
And there's never less than a dozen books there that I'm either prepping it, recording it, waiting for pickups, waiting for a rights holder review, waiting to get paid. Like it's invoiced, but it's not paid. Like there's never less than a dozen books there at any given time. And then it's like, yeah, no wonder I can't remember what I was doing 2 weeks ago.
I'm interested in thinking about all of the resources that surround our time with audiobooks. We talked with Jeremy about like working at home and like staying focused. I'm a big fan of the Narrator Alliance, finding community in getting that kind of support. Even thinking about like systems of organization, Kirt. Like I feel like I have given one-on-one presentations so many times about like the websites and programs that I use to organize my stuff because spreadsheets do bring me joy. But I am curious, like I think some resources and supports find us just as business tools. But I'm curious about like, have there been moments where the resources that you're using have kind of changed in significance for you as your why changed around audiobooks?
I mean, I know for me, there have been moments where, and specific pivotal times where I'm like, oh, like I need to connect with my community, like where that becomes so, and it's like the community's always there, and when I think back, it's actually been how I really started and continued to progress in this career. It was like because I met someone in a class in person who was like, "Hey, you should come to the LA Narrator SAG meeting." And then I went to that for a while, and then someone there was like, "Hey, you should maybe go to APAC." What's APAC? And like these big moments happen, and so I guess I'm almost like I retroactively can see how like, yeah, like the community is so essential. And I guess what I meant earlier is like there have been moments where like I moved this past year, like last year, moved out of LA to a much smaller city. And I had a moment where I was like, I need to get back on that Narrator Alliance Zoom meeting. I need to see some other faces and just kind of and realize, oh, that was it. That was there all along. That was essential all along. But now I can like define that that's part of my drive.
I guess I would just say I find myself relying on organizational tools and databases and automations more than I ever did before.
Yeah.
That if I went back and talked to year one me, he might be appalled at the lack of a personal touch that every single book gets. But it got to the point where like, well, if I'm not, I need to not forget to email the author, the indie author I'm supposed to be recording their book in 1 month. I cannot forget to email them a month out and be like, hey, these are the dates. These are the things I need from you if you haven't sent them to me. And so like the answer to that was to automate an email, so that when the date comes close, it just gets sent. And if they're listening to this and realizing that they're not getting a personalized email from me, I'm so sorry. But
he loves you.
but it's in order to not lose track of all the different projects because they come to us in so many different ways. And so you can be doing very different things from week to week, depending on what's on your calendar a week from now, 2 weeks from now. Do I have a production house project where they give you a lot of resources and pronunciations and notes from the author? Am I doing a publisher project where, they equally support you with, whatever it is that you get from a publisher versus an indie author where you have to ask for it and you have to sometimes reach out and have the conversation. And even within those different things, different houses, different publishers, different indie authors will give you different things. And so, yeah, I needed at a certain point, I needed to use the tools to simply not forget what I need for each project. Because there is a certain part of your brain that does have to sit in the thing you're actually recording today. And by the time you're done recording some days, I just got done with a project that like wrecked me, and not in a good way. Like, it was just such a struggle for me. It's probably my least favorite thing I've ever recorded. And not for any reason that's like a dig on the book or the author. I just didn't connect with it in any way. And it was so difficult to get through. I didn't understand the writing. And by the time I was done with what I needed to get done each day, it had taken me twice as long as normal. And I was exhausted. I could not have picked up an iPad to prep for the future. Like, there was no way at the end of those days. And I scheduled 5 days for that book. It took 8. And so for 8 days, I just like went home feeling almost like drunk and unable to look at a screen.
Yeah.
And so if automations and organization and tools and resources and reaching out to people during that time to be like, hey, I am really struggling. I'm just having one of those experiences. Whatever it takes to use those things to stay on top of it so that you don't compound the issue by being so far behind on the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, because it is a set of dominoes when you schedule back to back, when you're lucky enough to schedule back to back.
Yeah.
The whole house of cards can fall over if you don't have your eye ahead of you. And sometimes your eye just has to be on what's in front of you because you just got to get through the fucking day.
I feel like there was a big point where my why was tied up in my sense of self, and then was also supplemented by like the flow of the work. There was a point from March through June of this year where Monday through Friday, every single day, except for the days I traveled, which was far too many in that time period, I was in a studio recording somewhere. It was great. I loved it. Rates I loved. Almost never recording at home. The whole time had something to do. But was also like pushing myself way too hard. Monday through Friday, 10 to 4 was a time frame that I was like, I really want to get in the studio. I really want to be doing this. And it took being in the middle of it to realize that if I'm in the studio 10 to 4, Monday through Friday, then I am coming home for a couple hours in the evenings to do emails. I am coming home to prepare books to get them prepped. All these other things are spilling out into other times, into weekends, into early mornings. I'm not at a place in my life where I've mastered sleep. I'm not. And it impacts my sleep when I try to like fit all those things together and like, oh, I really want to make sure I'm going to the gym this many times a day, like, or this many times a week. My God, not a day. And like fitting that in, social life, like all those things together didn't crunch into place in the way that I needed them. And then the rare home record book would show up, and it would not just, my brain would just not turn on for the work in the same way. It would spill into a weekend. It would overlap into, having to come home from a studio day to record. And I feel like a lot of there is, I think, a big part of me, like, in my opening just now, it was like, are we waiting for that big book? Like, that's a self call out. I feel like I've been waiting for that big book for a long time. And part of the truth is I also just haven't been doing this as long as it sometimes feels like I've been doing this. This is going to be year 4 in January. But like trying to, like get considered for higher rate projects, or thinking about like the mindset I had about like which kinds of rates I would take in different contexts, I don't feel aligns with what I'm thinking right now. And it really tied me up in this place where I remember one particular project that I ended up being, I think, like a week late on it, as it was like sandwiched around all the studio recording. And I would get home and my voice would be raw, and I'd sit down and I'd like get an hour out of that book. And it was shorter relatively. It was like 6 hours, but I'd like get an hour out of it, know that it was already behind, and just like the slump, the energy spiral in me would just take me out of it and leave me in this really challenging place where, like you said, Kirt, like not every single book can be taken care of like we did day 1, but you want something of you in there. You're going to put it out into the world with your name on it. You want to feel good about it. And I know that was impactful on that like relationship with, that production team, like not getting it in as quickly as they wanted it in. And I feel like the saving grace for me was getting to listen back to it recently, um,
Mm.
and listening and being like, wow, I think that this is some of my best work. And I wish that I could have heard the version of this where I had put together the time I needed and the space I needed, right? Had myself set up and my world set up in the way that I needed it to be in order to maybe even have brought this title home in a way that I loved more. And I feel like that's where my why has like shifted around my resources and my thought process, is that there is work-life balance, and then there's also, this like intertwining of like how the books reach us or don't reach us, don't connect with us and leave us strained, how they impact other people. The number of like really powerful personal titles I've seen narrators work on, and a review comes back, an email comes back out of the void from a listener. I had a friend recently who produced a book that she did not love narrating. She didn't love narrating it. And a listener called the production company and left a voicemail saying that, and there was another narrator on the book, saying that she specifically reached that listener, and that listener wanted to make sure that she knew that she had loved her work. I have never
Aw.
heard of that before.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like, I think it's that. I think like, I fret so much about AI narration and AI, books and all those things, not just because I hate it, not just because I hate it, but also because I feel like that kind of care needs to be in things, especially when they're things that, are just kind of designed to like fill the space. You want to put out 60 AI audiobooks because you want to put out 60 books, not because you want to bring 60 authors who care about a story together with 60 narrators who are going to care about that story in some way. But point being, I dream of a world where, the circumstances around like how we can arrive at books gives us more joy. I feel like I keep playing back to the joy. Gives us more chances to like communicate care. I wonder what so many, because sometimes I feel like the titles are there, the number of titles produced a year are there. I wonder what so many people's careers would look like if like 3 out of 4 books that they narrated were books that they felt like they loved. Because I do regularly feel like sometimes the conversation is like, I need to pay rent. I got to get that, like, you know, it was written, that cryptocurrency manual, like narrated and out the door. You know what I mean? But it feels intertwined. It feels really complicated.
But I'm so glad, though, you mentioned, André, that like even when you had to do the book, you're tired after being in the studio, but you listened back and you were like, oh wow, this is really like I've had that sometimes when I'm having trouble or struggling with a book or just feeling like it's taken a long time. I'll listen to what I did the day before, and it'll kind of be, usually it's surprisingly better than I thought it was, and then I'm like, oh okay, well that kind of gives me a little fuel for today. Like it's not, like there's something happening, and I don't know. I just think and again, it's something we just don't get that perspective, especially you're doing a home record. No one's there to listen and be like, hey, you're doing great. Even if there is an engineer, you might be like, yeah, they're going to say that. It's like, but to actually get that, even that little distance of that day, or maybe you listen to it even with more distance is even better, to have that space to go like, what was that like a few months ago? I feel like that can help. That can help. I don't know. Remind us that one, yeah, when we don't have the ability to spread things out and give them the space that we would love to, that it's okay but two, that that there's some, I don't know, I find that really motivating to be like, yeah, like I'm doing it. At least it's like a reminding me that yes, I am bringing something to this. And that kind of reminds me that I I'm fulfilling a purpose. Because I the other thing is I thought about what even is purpose before this talk.
Yeah.
What was I made for? And it's like, what is the thing that I can uniquely bring to what I'm doing? And that might not be apparent, but maybe it is if we can take that time and like actually look at our work with some objectivity.
Yeah. And I mean, if you have the great good fortune to go to a reader conference where people are familiar with your work, that is also one of the best ways to fill your cup and to
Yeah.
be reminded that, like, one, that you are good at what you do, and two, that people love it. People love what you create. And I think the paychecks are nice, but if you don't every once in a while get reminded that there are people in the world whose days are infinitely easier or better because they're able to listen to a story told to them by another human being,
Yeah.
filled with emotion and nuance and compassion and joy, that is sometimes what is getting people through. And sometimes it's just, they can be an audiobook a day person, but still it's the experience of, like, getting to listen to you tell them a story really matters. And so that's one thing I try to remember when I'm having, like, this last week, I was reminding myself of that. I was like, somewhere out there is somebody who's going to listen to this book that I am just really, really struggling with, and they cannot hear how much I'm struggling with it, even though it is taking so much longer and it is so much harder on my brain and my voice than books usually are. They cannot hear it in the final performance. And then the other thing is, like, I sometimes got to remind myself, I was like, you can talk a big game about, like, keeping it professional and, like, it's just the work, but, like, you are also the person who will be doing a Russian bear mafia gay shifter book, and you will be crying in the booth. You will be crying that somebody got shot or somebody's having a baby. Like, you will cry at the weirdest moments because you're just so invested in this story that you may not remember 7 days from now even doing. But when you're in it, you're in it. And that is, it's a part of myself that cracks open when I'm telling a story that doesn't really exist in other parts of the world when I'm out in the world. Can we, before we get too far off it, I do want to circle back to, like, the awards part.
Yeah.
Because I do, like, it's not my why for doing the work, but it is still a goal. Like, it's one of the things I haven't reached yet that does keep me interested, keeps that ADHD part of me, like, engaged in the game of getting audiobooks, not doing audiobooks, getting audiobooks, because I am more convinced than ever that sometimes the best thing you can do to get an award is to get a really great book or a high profile book. So, like, that part of the game still exists for me, and that part's still fun. Like, going out there and trying to snag, like, what's going to be the award-winning book for Kirt Graves? I don't know, but we're going to keep trying to snag them.
Yeah. And I'm trying to vague reference another project without, like, dropping it in
I get
as
it.
a great.
If it were not for the safety of this episode airing months after we recorded, I would not have talked about this book I just did, but you have no idea what time it is.
But again, having recently listened to a lot of samples over and over and over again, I feel like I'm not going to call it a fiction. I am going to call it an important acknowledgement that I've come across the perspective many times that, like, if the audio awards were really about fantastic performances, all the books would be titles you've never heard of. I think you've even said that to me before, Kirt, right? And I think one that is absolutely true. People are there are books put out in the world where sometimes And this is not a reflection on any specific author. I think it's just a reality of how some people move through publishing. Sometimes I think there are books put out in the world where the audiobook narrator puts more thought and heart and time into it than maybe the writer did. And they are lifting that book up. They are putting in that like 12 years of stage work. They're putting in that Yale education. They're putting in whatever it is into that book. And they are giving us a cast. They are giving us storytelling. They're giving, you know what I mean? And I think that is absolutely true. And in addition, I also feel like it's become exponentially clear to me that titles set us up for the range of play that we can have, especially in situations where, for example, like we've auditioned and there's an expectation about kind of what the tone is going to be, or there's some kind of precedent for what the performance is. There are a lot of titles that are great and well written and are going to take us through a story, but aren't necessarily going to give you space to have this really dynamic conversation between three characters, or this really interesting wordplay, or these really peculiar choices, or whatever it is. Books set us up for so many possibilities in the text. It is real and true. And I feel I know it to be true for myself that it impacts awards, it impacts recognitions, it impacts all these other kinds of things. People's, judges, reviewers' love of certain authors, certain narrators impacts all those things. They're not what I'm not going to call them like unfair or kind of like rule breaking biases by any means. I think there are a lot of narrators who are beloved repeatedly because they have done a lot of amazing work over a long time and continue to do amazing work. And it just feels more clear to me than ever that the book sets you up for performances sometimes.
Yeah. Although even as you say that, I'm thinking strangely about how much fun it can be sometimes when in the back of your head you can think, nobody's ever going to listen to this.
Those are some of the best performances, I think, is I'm like, I'm really free and I'm being creative and I'm adding layers and things to it. And then it's like, oh, that was I hope someone does listen to that, because
Yeah. There are all these different kinds of precedents that happen in publishing. Like sometimes a publisher is like, it's this debut author, we're investing in them. This book is going to be big. You just wait. And then sometimes it's like they had this huge big book, and now we're just going to put, we're going to put them on the National Book Award circuit or the whatever it is, where like maybe we're submitting them and there's some nice reviews, but there's not necessarily sales, listeners, etc. Sometimes it's some other combination of whatever it is. But I do feel like I have, and it's middle grade for me. That's the genre where it just keeps happening. It's like I put down finish recording the last chapter of a book. I'm like, that rearranged my heart from the inside out. Like that reached me like at my childhood, at the root. A year later, there's like 2 reviews on that title, maybe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and then talk about awards. I was just having this conversation with some narrator friends the other day because the Sovis nominations came out and the Audie deadline just happened. And it was like we were talking about like titles that we loved and that we were really proud of, that we considered maybe putting forward. And I'll just speak for myself. Like I looked at the reviews and it was like, oh, like 5 people have read this book. So like, it's like, no, it's not worth the investment of submitting it for an award when it just doesn't have the eyeballs on it,
Yeah. And I'll this will circle back to our core in a second too, but I will say in this little corner of the internet, listen, if anybody is going to shoot me about it. But for virtually the same price, you are picking a 5-minute sample for the Sovis and submitting it. And I will say, like, when I realized that and started picking like really juicy moments of the book instead of just the retail sample, it felt like there were different results. But for virtually the same price, if someone is going to through the audios, listen to the entire book, maybe multiple times, it feels, the impact feels different. That's also to say that, like, I think Sovis is significantly less concerned with the full text and how much that book was publicized. And I'm not going to say that the audience judges are at all like, oh, I'm listening and I'm going to go check, like, you know, on Audible, like but there are implications. There are other things reaching them. They're just very different words. That all being said, like what you said about how your why ties into that, Kirt, I do feel like, and this is a thing I haven't mastered. It's started in my head when we had that conversation with Deep D, and I feel like I haven't mastered it yet. Is there are those titles like the one I just listened back to, where I just have to open Canva, put something together, and print that award out for myself and keep chugging on. Because if I really hit like a true sadness about not receiving any kind of external recognition about it, especially pinning it on like my wall, like I have, like, wow, I really loved this performance. I have to be able to go to the next book, you know?
And if nothing else, now you're going to remember that book when someone asks you, what are some of your favorite books you've done? Because you took that moment and you know, like, I'm thinking that's a great idea. Because sometimes you'll go, oh yeah, that was a really good book. So now I'm glad you took that time and did that.
Because really, the other dimension of this is that we can participate in the politics of the work that we do, which is, like you said, Kirt, connecting with producers who you think are going to send you something that has a higher chance of like landing on someone's radar. And, you know, building, like, I just got last week 2 different titles from authors that I've narrated for before. And I'm excited, not because I think either one of those is necessarily going to be some big selling title or going to be like award recognitions. I'm excited because one of those authors liked me enough off the first book that they requested me for the second book. And the other author has spoken positively of me before. And when I sent an audition, came back, you know, resoundingly. And I'm like, I love that. I love that connection. I love that relationship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, it's the same thing. I think, you know, all the same stuff I said during Deep D's episode. Do I still submit titles to AudioFile once a month? I do. Did I spend more money than I should have submitting Audi titles this year? I absolutely did, you know?
Well, but I hope that that's an indicator of how proud you are of that work.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, and thanks for saying the thing about, you know, the author wanted you back, because that happened to me a couple months ago, and it was for that book, the first book. I did submit it for the Sovas, did not get chosen. But I'm like, but you know what? But the author, whose writing I think is awesome, wanted me back. Like that. That's a huge award to me.
I'm curious, Alex, since you're and are still, I think, in the LA area, you know, like you're an actor in a land of actors. I think that's what LA stands for. Like,
I like that.
How does that affect your motivation to do this work specifically? When you're looking at a whole bunch of people who are hustling to do performance of any kind, and then you find this thing that works for you. Like, how does that affect you?
I mean, there have been different parts of my career as an actor or an artist where I really tried to lean into something other than being a auditioning actor to try to get something else to take off, you know, whether it was like writing a solo show, or I thought I was going to like write musicals at one point, or, you know, and so when audiobooks when I started to get some jobs, and I was like, maybe if I invest in that. So it was something that I think I was always seeking, because I felt very turned off by just being in this environment where I just, you know, because it's like, it's one of the best ways to feel expendable or feel like you have nothing. Because you're like, I go to an audition, there's a million other people who, better looking than me and better, whatever. It's like, oh, now there's this thing where I put my work in. And there was a thing too where I was looking to do voiceover more broadly because I was like, oh, with my voice, I can play so many more roles and I can, like I'm not just bound by how I look. And so I guess to answer your question is like just a lot of joy, I guess, or feeling like it was some hack of like, yeah, see, I'm acting, but I can do it in this other way. And I'm just not competing as much. I'm not just throwing myself against the same wall as everybody else. However, still was really fun to go to LA for the Audis and to feel like, okay, like it feels special to be in this place that is this like
Yeah.
mecca of, just celebrating fame and all this stuff. And to be like, yeah, like maybe I don't know. It's like kind of an interesting little, um, it's poetic in a way, I guess, to if you could, to go attend and to find too that attending that awards ceremony felt, as people have talked about, have felt so celebratory and didn't feel like we're measuring each other's talents or who won how many, whatever.
Yeah. The thing I think that has made me so consistently shift my why, especially in regards to recognition, like we talked about too, I think has also been these opportunities to be in conversation with people back and forth about like how their why has navigated them through the space. And I feel like there's so many kinds of things that I know can't be universal, and so I'm always interested in how they expand or get rewritten. I know that a lot of people cherish working with production companies, and I know that there will never be a point where every audiobook narrator will have some big chunk of their work coming from production companies. Um, Same thing about big titles, about awards, about whatever it is. And I think that there are places where two things are happening that I love. One is that I think we are regularly revisiting how we define these things. Because I do think like the narrative has to exist for it to reach us and to sit within us. Like I remember really early on my why being all about like working with Penguin and really putting it on the shelf for myself. And that didn't necessarily manifest out of nowhere. Like that was part of the story. That was part of what the comments on ACX were telling me. That was part of all these different things. And it's unfortunate, I think, sometimes that like we have these stories and that we start from that place. But I also think that like the more we navigate and revisit a lot of these stories, I'm curious again how people's why transforms when it's driven specifically by their joy, by their intentions, by their wants, by the factors of their life that surround them and guide their work. Um, there's a whole different world and life my narration journey could have taken while I still had a full time job. In terms of not saying yes to virtually every single thing that ever fell in my lap, and thinking about specificity and taking myself to places where work I was most excited about might have been more abundantly. But ultimately, though, like, I do feel so responsible for myself in terms of like adjusting my why and making it feel like it suits the way that I'm arriving at the work because it has over and over and over again. And I feel like I see it in the conversations we have on this podcast over and over and over again. My why is tied into my work, and my work is tied into my life, and my life informs my why. And that cycle, it feels like I have to be actively responsible for that cycle in order for its changes to benefit me over time.
I mean, it feels like maybe what you're saying is something that I thought about too. That's like, I want to, you know, I want to get more notoriety so I can do projects that I feel like I can best, you know, express my unique voice through the work.
Hmm.
And so I can keep doing it. And so it's like, in order to contribute something of greater significance, or so, not that the books that one person listens to aren't significant, but to have, to make a bigger, to give something more, I need to like find ways to keep getting the work.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot on this podcast about how much of the work is getting the work. And I guess what we lose in that is the joy and the celebration of what happens when you actually get in the booth and you get to tell a story. And we can't lose track of the whatever weird little part of us opens up when we're in front of a microphone and we're telling a story that we didn't even write, but that we relate to and that we can empathize with, and that we can bring our own experiences into, even though it's wildly different than something we may have or could ever experience. Because yeah, those moments are great. That's so much fun. If the whole job could just be the performing, oh boy, like then this would easily be the top job I've ever had. But the whole job is not just the performing.
But I also like audaciously, at the very least, like just to have the discussion, ask like, why can't the whole job be the performing? What things,
I mean, I think what it would take for that to be the whole job is somebody else's whole job would have to be getting us the work.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where, like earlier in the conversation, I was thinking about like how I need to be better about letting books go that I think I won't fully enjoy, because that means they could find the person who will fully enjoy it. Yeah. And that in order for somebody else to find work that fulfills them, I might need to let go of work that doesn't fulfill me. In the same way, maybe we just need to start finding people who want to do the parts of our job that aren't the actual narration. Like, we already employ preppers and editors. Why not a personal assistant or somebody who does just social media for us, or maybe we finally get audiobook agents. Not that I'm advocating for that, but like if that was the world where like, yeah, they went and found us the work for us and they knew us well enough to get us work that we were good for and would enjoy. And then our prepper sends us the prep and we just have to review that for like an hour before we get in the booth and just get to have fun playing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that sounds great. Sure. Let's do that. That's out in the world now.
Maybe it's a business model somewhere. I love that. That's what we're going to end on. Somebody go out there, bring together an agent, bring together like a couple preppers, like an engineer, and then we'll commute in, I'll come into the studio. I'll be like, what are we working on this week? You'll sit down with me in the prep, show me the author's notes. I'll get in the booth for a few days. I love it. I love it. Are you kidding me? I'm all about it.
Sign me up.
Fantastic.
We need to find a small town in like Utah where we can just take over.
The audiobook town. Wait, yeah. Okay. I see a mystery kind of thriller about this now. I love it. I absolutely love it. I feel like as we continue moving throughout our work, the why is going to continue to adjust. The industry is also going to change and like introduce new things, I feel like I've had conversations with people who have gotten their big break or their moment, and it's shifted the work that comes after, their relationships to producers, whatever. And they get to have like this re-navigation of what their why is, what their purpose is, and it adjusts how they find support. It adjusts, how they interact with the community, whatever it is. I think things change, but it also feels like it's been important to just look at it and talk about it and feel it and recognize that it's real and that it's shifting. Because otherwise I feel like you can't arrive at the work with honesty if you don't honestly know why you're there. But with that, thank you again, Alex, for joining us today. This has been such a wonderfully pleasant conversation.
Such a pleasure and a joy, speaking of joy, to talk to both of you. Thank you so much.
I love it. I love it. Thanks to all our listeners for joining us at the Narrator Roundtable. If you want to join the conversation, you can find us on social media, or you can visit our website at narratorroundtable.com. You can submit a question or a topic of discussion for a future episode. What's on your mind? We want to talk about it.
Come on.
The Narrator Roundtable is produced and hosted by André Santana, Deanna Anthony, Gail Shalan, Kirt Graves, and Lindsey Dorcus. All copyrighted material is shared with permission. Music and sound effects are licensed through Storyblocks Audio. All opinions shared are those of the individuals and do not reflect the positions or policies of any company or organization with which they happen to be associated.